That question echoed through the mind of Lieutenant Alan Mercer as he stood inside a bunker carved into the cliffs of Kent, England. Outside, the sky pulsed with distant thunder, not from storms, but from V-1 flying bombs, Germany's mechanical predators. Each one carried nearly a ton of explosives, each one aimed at civilians who had done nothing but try to live. Alan wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold. He was an engineer, not a soldier. His hands were used to soldering wires, not gripping a helmet as the earth trembled. Yet here he was, the unlikely guardian of a classified invention so powerful it could shift the momentum of the war. Behind him, soldiers watched radar screens with growing dread. They didn't know what Alan knew. They didn't know that the shells loaded into the British anti-aircraft guns were equipped with something unprecedented, a device that could sense a target in mid-air. A VT proximity fuse. Alan swallowed. If this works, everything changes. Across the channel, a man Alan had never met, Klaus Bremer, a brilliant German mathematician, was about to be ordered to solve a mystery his superiors refused to acknowledge. The mystery Alan was about to unleash. Alan remembered the day he was recruited. He wasn't a warrior. He was a quiet man who loved circuit diagrams more than conversation. But his designs were bold, and the military needed bold. Commander Roth had placed a small metal cylinder in his hands, a fuse barely longer than Alan's palm. Inside this, Roth said, is a tiny radar set, small enough to survive being fired from a cannon, smart enough to detect when a target is within lethal range. Alan had stared at it like it was sorcery. "It detonates automatically?" he asked. "At precisely the right distance," Roth said. "No more shots guessing, no more shells detonating too soon or too late. The fuse thinks." Alan almost laughed at the absurdity. But the science was real, painfully real. They had spent years perfecting the circuit, calculating frequencies, testing resilience. But practical use, against fast-moving V-1 bombs, that part was still unproven. And now the unproven was about to be tested in the most unforgiving environment imaginable: war. Meanwhile, in a cramped office in northern France, Klaus Bremer reviewed rows of figures. To others, numbers were dull. To Klaus, they were truth. They revealed the world without lies. But today, his numbers didn't make sense. He had calculated V-1 survival rates every week. They were consistent, predictable. A weapon of consistency. That was the V-1. But yesterday's statistics. Something impossible had happened. 82% shot down, Klaus whispered. His superior officer, Major Reinhardt, stormed in. "These numbers are wrong." Klaus pushed up his glasses calmly. "Numbers don't lie, sir." "Then the British have suddenly learned magic," Reinhardt barked. "Fix the report." Klaus bit his tongue. He was a mathematician, not a propagandist, but he also knew better than to argue with men who preferred comforting fiction to uncomfortable truth. Yet the truth nagged at him. Something has changed on the British side, something radical, and he intended to find out what it was. Fog rolled across the hills of Kent when the first distant pulse jet rumble began. British gunners ran into position, slamming shells into their guns. Alan stood beside them, nerves igniting like electricity. He held a clipboard, but his hand shook so badly he pressed it against his chest. A spotter shouted, "First V-1, inbound." The sound intensified. Everyone felt it before they heard it, the vibration crawling along the earth like a living thing. The first shell fired. It missed by a mile. The second shell exploded too early, scattering useless fragments. Alan's heart sank. Please, please don't fail now. And then the third shell fired, one equipped with the new VT Fuze. Seconds passed, the shell climbed, approached the V-1. Alan watched through binoculars, breath frozen. Then, boom! The explosion wasn't random, it wasn't a lucky hit. It detonated right beside the V-1, slicing its wing. The bomb spiraled downward like a wounded bird before slamming into a field. Silence, then cheers. Alan's knees nearly buckled. It works. One hit wasn't enough to declare victory. But the next V-1 fell too, and the next, and the next. It was like the sky had suddenly turned against the German bombs. British gunners shouted, laughed, wept openly. Hardened soldiers, men who rarely expressed emotion, hugged each other like children reunited after a storm. Civilians emerged from shelters, staring at the sky in disbelief. Alan remained still, tears stinging his eyes. He wasn't a hero. He never wanted to be. But the device he helped create was saving thousands of lives. He whispered to himself, "Emma, I wish you could see this." But he knew he could never tell his sister or anyone else about today. This victory would be hidden under layers of classified reports. Across the channel, German analysts would be staring at their own numbers, confused and frustrated. And one man, Klaus, would feel the truth moving closer. Klaus sat with his report clutched tightly in his hand, staring at it as if it were a confession. For hours he reviewed every variable: launch conditions, weather patterns, altitude, timing, British gun density. None of it explained an 82% destruction rate. Major Reinhardt slammed his fist on the table. The British got lucky. Klaus shook his head. Luck doesn't increase by 80% overnight. Then offer a better explanation. Klaus hesitated. If he said what he suspected, he risked being dismissed as delusional, or worse, accused of defeatist thinking. But the numbers insisted. Something new was introduced, he said quietly. Some technology, something unprecedented. Reinhardt scoffed. Impossible. The British are farmers with rifles. Klaus wanted to argue, but he knew better. So he bowed his head and returned to his desk. But inside him, a seed had been planted, a suspicion so dangerous that the wrong person hearing it could end his life. That night, Alan sat alone under a dim lamp, exhaustion dragging at his bones. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing to Emma, imagining her safe at home in Connecticut. Dear Emma, if anything happens to me, I want you to know that I didn't fight with bullets or anger. I fought with circuits and hope. I just wanted to protect people, the way I've always wanted to protect you. He paused, staring at the tear stain forming on the page. If only the world understood how much one act of protection can change everything. He folded the letter. But then he remembered the rules. No personal letters, no details, no mention of the project. With a heavy heart, he tore it up. His feelings, and the truth, would remain locked away, because the world wasn't ready for this story. Not yet. Unable to accept silence, Klaus began his own investigation. But the military guarded information like gold. They denied every request. So he turned to another, unreliable but honest source: the wounded pilots returning from missions over the channel. One pilot lay bandaged, barely awake. Klaus whispered, "Tell me, what did you see?" The man trembled. They exploded before we reached them. The shells, they burst at perfect distance, as if as if the British shells could see us. Klaus felt his pulse spike. That was all he needed. It was impossible, improbable, and exactly the explanation he had feared. A proximity mechanism, a thinking fuse, radar inside a shell. If true, it would change everything. But he could tell no one. Not yet. 2 days later, just after sunset, a sound like a swarm of angry hornets filled the air. Radar picked up dozens of V-1s. This time, the British were ready. Alan sprinted between gun crews, checking circuits, adjusting frequencies, helping load shells. His clothes were soaked with sweat. The guns fired relentlessly. Each VT-equipped shell exploded with devastating accuracy, turning the sky into a field of bright scars. One V-1 after another dropped, fiery tails marking their descent. Troops cheered with each explosion. But then, a roar louder than the rest. A V-1 slipped into a blind spot, its engine sputtering mid-air as it lost altitude over the town. The explosion rocked the earth. Flames rose into the night. Alan staggered, heart cracking. Victory didn't erase tragedy, and tragedy didn't erase responsibility. He whispered, "I have to make this better. I have to." Klaus's investigation had grown too large to hide. His private notes filled an entire folder. When Reinhardt barged into his office, Klaus knew the moment he had feared had arrived. "What is this nonsense?" the major demanded, slamming Klaus's notes onto the desk. "You're suggesting radar inside artillery shells. Are you mad? That's science fiction." Klaus steadied his breathing. "It fits the data." "It fits your imagination," Reinhardt barked. Klaus stared into the man's eyes. "No, it fits reality. And if we pursue the wrong explanation because it feels comfortable, then we lose." Reinhardt glared. "What are you suggesting?" Klaus hesitated. "If I tell them how to counter the fuse, more British civilians will die." So he said quietly, "I am suggesting we stop pretending our weapons are unstoppable." Reinhardt fell silent, unsure whether to punish him or consider his words. Klaus turned away, feeling the walls close in. He was a German officer, but he was also a human being, and war had begun demanding he choose one. Alan was summoned at dawn to the command tent. He hadn't slept. His hands trembled from exhaustion, and his eyes burned from days of strain. Inside, Commander Roth waited with a stern expression. "Lieutenant Mercer," Roth said, "we need to talk about your safety." "My safety?" Alan frowned. "Sir, the priority is the fuses." "No," Roth interrupted. "The priority is that you remain alive. If the Germans learn you're tied to this tech, they'll try to capture you." That possibility had always lurked at the edge of Alan's mind, but today the warning felt colder, realer. "You carry the full design in your head," Roth continued. "Lose you, and we lose the ability to repair, adapt, or advance the fuse." Alan swallowed. He never wanted to be essential. Being essential meant being hunted. Roth added quietly, "This invention might shorten the war. Protect yourself at all costs." For the first time, Alan realized that genius wasn't a blessing. It was a burden, a heavy one. Far across the channel, Klaus sat alone in his cramped quarters, the dim lamp casting shadows across pages of forbidden notes. A soft knock startled him. Opening the door, he found Liesel, a childhood friend turned battlefield nurse. Her eyes were tired, her hair tucked under a worn cap. "Klaus," she whispered urgently, "may I come in?" He stepped aside. She closed the door behind her and spoke in a hurried voice. "We received wounded technicians from Peenemünde. They said the British shells aren't normal. They explode at precise distances. Some are calling them ghost shells. Klaus felt his stomach tighten. His theory was no longer just theory. Liesel stepped closer. Klaus, promise me you won't get involved in this madness. He looked at his notes. The truth was already inside him. I can only promise one thing, he said softly. I won't help kill anyone else. Her eyes softened, full of pride, worry, and something unspoken. In a world obsessed with destruction, two hearts quietly chose compassion. Back in Kent, Alan dragged himself into the communications tent and collapsed onto an empty chair. He didn't expect anyone to notice him, but Margaret, the British radio operator with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, approached him carrying a steaming mug. You look like a ghost that got hit by another ghost, she said. He managed a tired smile. I suppose that's a compliment. She pushed the mug into his hands. Drink. It's tea strong enough to wake the dead. Alan sipped and nearly coughed. Is this legal? Not officially, she winked. The smallest smile tugged at his lips. Margaret sat beside him. You carry something heavy. I see it every time you walk in here. He hesitated. He couldn't tell her the truth, but he could tell her something real. I just want the killing to stop, he whispered. She touched his arm gently. Then keep doing what you're doing. You're saving people, Alan. Don't forget that. It was the first time he allowed himself to believe it. Despite Klaus's subtle sabotage, Germany's intelligence division eventually pieced the truth together. A meeting was called. Engineers, officers, and analysts gathered around a map covered in red marks, failed V-1 attacks. This pattern is not random, one analyst said confidently. Note the consistent distance of detonation. Another added, this cannot be timed fuses. These shells are reacting to the bombs. A hush fell across the room. So what are we facing? Asked a general. A younger engineer swallowed hard. A proximity sensor, something like radar. Klaus kept his face neutral, though his heart hammered. And how do we counter it? The general demanded. Silence. Because no one knew. The British had gained a technological advantage so massive that Germany was caught unprepared. Klaus felt a quiet relief. A weapon that spared the innocent deserved no counter. The constant stress finally took its toll. During another heavy bombardment, Alan ran between the gun crews, giving last-minute adjustments, correcting circuits, showing soldiers how to check the fuse integrity. But as he turned to answer a question, his vision blurred. The ground tilted. He collapsed. Margaret rushed to him, shouting for medics. Soldiers gathered, fear etched deeply across their faces. The man who kept the miraculous devices functioning was on the ground, pale and barely conscious. A medic checked his pulse. Extreme exhaustion, dehydration, he needs rest, now. As they carried him toward the infirmary, Margaret whispered, Why do you do this to yourself? Alan forced out a weak breath. Because every time a V-1 falls, a family is spared. Her eyes softened. And if you fall, who saves those families then? He had no answer. And that truth frightened him more than any bomb. Orders arrived on Klaus's desk. Assist in development of countermeasures to enemy proximity explosions. He stared at the document, heart heavy. If he obeyed, he'd help create defenses that allowed more V-1s to reach British cities. More explosions, more shattered families. He lifted his pencil and deliberately began writing flawed equations. calculations that would lead nowhere, dead ends disguised as breakthroughs. Every stroke of the pencil was an act of rebellion. He knew the risk. Sabotaging war research was treason, but some truths were worth dying for. He closed the file, hands trembling. For the first time since the war began, Klaus felt like he had chosen the right side, humanity's side. Late August, a massive formation of V-1s approached, the largest yet. This was Germany's last desperate attempt to break morale. British operators screamed warnings. Gun crews scrambled. Alan, still recovering, stood against medical advice. Margaret protested, but he refused to sit idle. "I have to be there," he said. "If something goes wrong," she grabbed his hand, "then I'm going with you." The sky erupted. Explosions lit up the clouds like burning stars. VT fuses detonated with surgical precision, ripping V1 after V1 from the air. Alan shouted instructions, guiding soldiers through malfunctions, correcting aim, adjusting circuits. Smoke and fire painted the horizon. When the final explosion echoed across the hills, the sky fell silent. Dozens of destroyed V1s. Only one reached British soil. Alan lowered his head, overwhelmed. They had done it. Margaret squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. "Alan, you helped end this nightmare." He didn't answer. He just let himself breathe. The war crumbled. Germany was falling apart, city by city, street by street. Amid the chaos, Klaus was summoned by Major Reinhardt. Klaus entered the office expecting imprisonment or execution. Reinhardt slammed the sabotaged equations onto the desk. "You think I'm too stupid to see what you did?" the major growled. Klaus raised his chin. "I will not help kill civilians." Reinhardt's jaw tightened. For a moment, Klaus thought death had finally come. But then, the major's expression softened. "Just barely. The war is ending," Reinhardt said quietly. "None of this matters anymore." He pushed the papers aside. "Take your things. Go." "I saw nothing." Klaus stared, stunned. "Why?" he whispered. Reinhardt looked away. "Because I'm tired of this war, too. A small act of mercy in a world drowning in cruelty." Klaus left the office trembling but free. After Germany's surrender, Allied scientists and German analysts were summoned to a neutral facility for technical review, part of an effort to understand and rebuild. Alan arrived reluctantly, unsure what to expect. His nerves twisted when he saw the room full of former enemies. At the far end of the table sat Klaus Bremer, thin, exhausted, eyes filled with years of quiet conflict. Their eyes met. Klaus stood and approached. "You were the one behind the fuses," Klaus said softly. "And you were the one who refused to counter them," Alan replied without hesitation. A moment of long silence. Then Klaus extended his hand. Alan took it. Two men who had unknowingly protected each other, one through creation, the other through resistance, now stood face to face after the war. Sometimes enemies are nothing more than strangers who never chose their circumstances. Years passed. Alan returned home, married Margaret, and lived a quiet life as a teacher and inventor. He published a memoir, not about war, but about engineering ethics. He wrote one sentence that became famous: "Technology wins battles, but conscience wins humanity." Klaus became a mathematics professor, beloved by students. When asked about the war, he always said the same thing: "I learned that the greatest equation of all is the one that balances power with compassion." Alan and Klaus wrote letters for decades, two men forever connected by a sky filled with explosions and the choices that stopped more from falling. Margaret often said, "People remember the noise of war, but they forget the quiet hearts who tried to end it." And so, while the VT fuses destroyed 82% of the V1s in one day, the real miracle was the humanity that survived beneath the smoke.